And we are now joined by Ms. Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the USA. Welcome, ma'am, to DD India News Hour. So in recent days, there's been a huge US military build-up off the Caribbean, including the deployment of the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford. This is a part of Washington's new campaign against Latin American drug cartels. Why this big change in approach to fight narco-terrorists?
Well, I think Trump has made security of the homeland his first priority, and security in the Western Hemisphere, as he calls it, which means the Americas. Now, of course, there has been a history of drug smuggling from Latin America into the US. But it is not as though that has aggravated. So there is this sense that under the guise of fighting narco-terrorism, the US is actually seeking regime change in Venezuela to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro. And that is what Maduro alleges. And perhaps we really don't know what the US objective is, whether it's going to stop at intercepting narcotics or drug which are being smuggled, or taking military action against smugglers' boats, or whether it is going to extend to really pressurizing a regime change in Venezuela. Because Venezuela has oil, and for President Trump, I think access to resources has become one of the key components of his strategy. If you see, he wanted Canada to join the US as a new state, he wanted Greenland, and Venezuela has high energy resources, especially fossil fuel, which President Trump has started exploiting. He has given permission for exploiting fossil fuel resources in a big way. So we have to wait and watch.
Okay.
Now, it would be a pity in a sense, because the US had moved towards a more mature policy in Latin America, where they had accepted social democratic left-wing governments in a way in which they had not accepted them in the past. And there have been natural cycles in which these governments have been voted out of power, and new right-wing governments have been voted in, and those right-wing governments have been voted out, and left-wing governments. So a more normal democratic, or more stable, if you could say, democratic cycle had started to establish itself in Latin America, in South America. But if we go back to the era of, when the US was overthrowing regimes like, in Chile or elsewhere, then I think we are really going back. The US would be going backwards in its policies vis-a-vis the Southern. There's no threat. I would say the main challenge that the US faces in Southern America is really the enormous economic presence that China has developed, and the Chinese control of resources in many of these countries. But the question is, how is Trump going to take that on? Because we are not sure what his policy towards China is going to be.
And that will be decided, of course, next week when Trump and Xi meet. But ma'am, how sincere and accurate is Venezuela's President Maduro when he says that Venezuela is a drug-free country and says that he'll put an end to cocaine trafficking? That comes from neighboring Colombia. Do his efforts so far to curb cocaine trafficking match his claims?
Well, cocaine trafficking Colombia has been the center of cocaine trafficking into the US, and a lot of drugs have flowed across the Mexican border actually into the US. You have Mexican cartels, you have Colombian cartels. Venezuela has not been a major source of drugs. But yes, the government of Nicolas Maduro has not really had free and fair elections in Venezuela. And the US has tried to overthrow the regime in the past or tried to, build an opposition, but they haven't succeeded as yet. And this is a continuation of the regime of Hugo Chavez and a very left-wing nationalistic platform. So I think there may be voices in the US saying the time has come to try and see if we can again resurrect the whole issue of regime change. You've seen the Nobel Peace Prize also, which has been given to a key member of the Venezuelan opposition. And it's a political choice. And so you can see that there is a renewed focus on the political scene in Venezuela.
Okay. Is this new method now being used by the US to target narco-terrorists, as they call these smugglers, involving the use of F-35s, US Navy ships, and now its largest warship, with current strained relations with Venezuela and Colombia? So this new strategy, do you think it will likely achieve its objective, or could it prove futile or even counterproductive?
Well, it could prove counterproductive because, Latin America has basically reacted in an antagonistic manner to what could be described as gunboat diplomacy, because they've experienced it in the past. And you've seen pressure is not just limited to Venezuela or Colombia, but it's also been exerted on Brazil. And you heard, Brazil too faces 50% tariff, even though Brazil actually has a trade deficit with the US. It's the US which has a trade surplus. And the whole idea is to break up the BRICS, to exert, and you've heard Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary of the US, saying, we have to fix India and Brazil. So I think it's something which doesn't go down well. Even if the US is able to force its way and to pressurize countries into accepting its policies, I think in the long run, it can build up a well of resentment against the US, which finds expression in the politics of those countries.
Okay, so thank you very much, ma'am. That was an interesting analysis there. Well, South America's tilt towards the China, and of course, Trump being very afraid of the grouping BRICS. We like to sum it up here. Thank you very much, Meera Shankarji, for being with us on the show.